Okay, chapter 11 focuses on the muscles. So lots of anatomy, lots of memorization, but we do have a few overview things to talk about first. Since we didn't talk about muscle tissue, we are just going to go over a few things that have to do with how our muscles work in the body and how we name them as well. So as you can see, the muscular system that we are talking about is only going to consist of skeletal muscles. There are obviously other types of muscle tissue in your body, smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, which we will focus on when we look at those systems. Muscles are organized in various ways, and that determines the types of movements, the range of movement, as well as the amount of power that can be generated by those muscles. Within a skeletal muscle, the muscle fibers themselves are organized into bundles, kind of like a bouquet of flowers, that are called fascicles. And basically, there are different patterns of fascicle arrangement, and you can see the four listed there. We have parallel fascicle arrangement, convergent, pennate, and circular. So we're going to take just a quick look at each of those so we have an understanding. So here is an example of parallel muscle fibers in fascicles, and you can see this is our bicep brachii, so our muscle here in our upper arm. And you can see the fascicle arrangement here in these parallel arrangements. Here is another type of parallel muscle. This is where we have tendons or banding in there, and this is our rectus abdominis muscle, or what people look for a six-pack or a 12-pack. And their abs, our most superficial abdominal muscle. So you can also have the parallel fibers with some tendon inside. And then you can also have a parallel fiber that wraps. So we have a muscle in our arm that is called the supinator muscle, responsible for supination. And you can see the parallel arrangement. So these bundles of fiber arranged in these parallel lines. The next type are called convergent muscles. And this example here is your pectoralis muscle. So that would be our chest muscles here, our anterior chest muscles. And you can see that there's a very wide base. Convergent muscles tend to look very fan-shaped, where you have this wide base, and then they all converge basically into a singular tendon here at the end. And again, you can take a look at the cross-section, looking at how those bundles of fibers are arranged. They're just packed in together, those fascicles are. Then we have this group called pennate, or like a pen or a feather. And there are three different types of pennate. The first is called unipennate, meaning there is just going to be these fibers that are going to flow, these fascicles, that are arranged in the following structure, this linear, leaf-like or feather pen-like structure. It's going to extend into a tendon. All right, so you can see one of our extensor muscles of our forearm would be a unipennate example. Then you have a bipennate. So here's our rectus femoris. This is the main quadricep muscle on our anterior thigh. And you can see that you essentially have both halves of the leaves or two sides to the feather, and that you have these fascicle arrangements branching out from that tendon on both sides, as opposed, let me go back, to just on a singular side. So that's uni and bipennate. Obviously, multipennate means we've got a lot going on. Essentially, we have several different sections of fascicles that are arranged in that kind of feather or leaf or feather pen-like structure. And you can see in the cross-section here are three of those that are all put together. This is our deltoid, so that's our shoulder cap muscle. And then again, they are going to come down into our tendon here. And lastly, we have the sphincter type arrangement, or the circular muscles. So these are going to be fascicle arrangements that are going to allow for kind of cinching, kind of like the bottom of like your jogger pants, where you have that elastic band at the base. That's what a circular muscle shape or arrangement of fibers is going to allow. It's going to allow for that kind of cinching or contraction. And we'll see this type of shape anywhere that we've got it going to have some type of sphincter-esque location. So that'll be around our eyes and around our mouth, were two examples we'll be looking at. So that's one thing that we want to make sure we're aware of is how the fascicles get arranged. So understanding that terminology, maybe an example of each would be good to recognize. The second overview piece for the muscles that we want to understand is that muscles function like levers. So muscles have to pull, they can't push. All right. And pretty much every single skeletal muscle is going to attach to some bone that we have studied. There are a few that are going to attach to some types of tendon sheets or connective tissue sheets. but those will be rare. All right. And where on the different skeletal bones the muscle contracts is going to, again, allow for the type of force it can generate, how fast it can operate, and then obviously range of motion, as we looked at in our joints unit. And so muscles, because they can only pull and not push, they are going to act as a lever. In other words, there is going to be some type of fixed point from physics class. You might remember that that's a fulcrum. So there's going to be some fixed point within the muscle joint arrangement. And that is going to be around which the muscle is going to apply a force to overcome whatever load, whatever, in this most cases, skeletal bone, it's going to have to move, right? And the joints that connect all of these bones and muscles are going to serve as the fulcrum, right? So there are a lot of different, there's a lot of physics that goes into muscular systems and muscle tissue. So those of you thinking of doing like PT and things like that, and athletic training, you definitely want to make sure that you're taking a physics class, because the physics behind how joints and muscles work, as well as tie into the skeletal system, is crucial to dealing with, especially a lot of the injuries that those types of professions see. In terms of what a lever can do, the whole purpose of using a lever is to be able to either do something faster or to generate more power, right? That's why we use things that, you use scissors to cut something, or you use tweezers to pull something out, use a wheelbarrow to carry rocks or dirt from one place to another. 3 different classes of levers are how we divide up where that fulcrum, where that load, and where that applied force is located. And they are divided by first, second, and third class, okay? And while I'm going to show you first and second, the most common type is actually a third class. So we're gonna spend a little bit more time on that. So here you can see an example of a first class lever showing you where the fulcrum, the applied force, and the load are located. So here you can see this person is applying the force here at the end. The fulcrum's closer to the load, but in the middle. And then here's the load he's trying to pry up that log, okay? In our body, we see an example of this with some of our splenius muscles in our neck, all right, allowing our neck to flex and to extend. And you can see, again, pictured here where all 3 of those factors would be. So there you'll see some first-class levers in the body, few and far between. Then you have a second-class lever, and this, again, we're changing the location. So my example for a second-class lever is always a wheelbarrow. You have your applied force on the end. You have your load this time in the center, and then you have the fulcrum on the opposite end of the applied force. In this case, our calf muscle, our gastrocnemius muscle, actually works in that way. The fulcrum being down in the foot area, the load being here at the ankle, and then obviously our applied force of our gastrocnemius pulling that heel up. And again, you can see the arrangement of fulcrum, load, and applied force for a second class lever. So again, you'll see a few of those throughout the body, few and far between. But the most common type of lever that we see our muscles form in our body is a third class lever, all right? The reason being is that third class levers tend to maximize speed and the distance traveled for that force at the expense of an effective force, all right? So in other words, it gets the job done quicker. And a lot of the stuff that we need to do does that. And that's why muscles are going to fatigue eventually because most of them are built in a third class lever format. So how does that look? That would be like a tweezers or a tongs, all right? Where you have your fulcrum at one end, your applied force this time is in the center or the middle, and then you have the load at the opposite end to the fulcrum. So our bicep brachii here is our example, our fulcrum being our joint, so our elbow joint. You can see our muscle here where it's attaching on the radius, and then obviously our forearm being the load that the bicep is lifting. And so you can see again that layout, all right? Don't get too concerned about the nitty gritty of the physics here. Just want you to have a general understanding that muscles serve as levers. The purpose of having different types of levers is to either change the speed or the amount of force that's being able to be exerted. And that the most common type of lever we are going to encounter in the body is going to be third class. All right, some terminology that you need to be familiar with before delving into the memorization of the muscles are origins and insertion. That's our first set. We'll get to a few more terms in a minute. The origin of a muscle is its stationary point. All right, this is the point at which the muscle originates, and that usually is going to be the stable bone, right? The bone that doesn't move. A muscle is then going to move out from that fixed point or that stable point, and it is going to insert into usually another bone or ligament or tissue or fascia, and that is going to be the movable point. So like I said, muscles only pull, they don't push. So I'm going to have an origin up here for my bicep, and I'm going to have an insertion down here so that when my muscle contracts, because it's only going to contract in one direction, I am going to be able to pull or lift whatever I'm inserted to. And then when my muscle relaxes, I'm able to allow that muscle to, or allow that, that inserted bone or whatever it is, return to its location, right? Another term that you want to be familiar with is something called an action. So an action, when we use it for a muscle, is basically what movements can it do? All right, can it flex? Can it extend? Can it ab or adduct? Can it rotate? And what type of rotation can it do? So all of that movement we talked about with our joints, now we're going to be applying them to particular muscles throughout the body. We also have terminology that relates how muscles interact with each other. So we like to describe muscles as having different roles in these actions, all right? A lot of muscles in our body work together as a group. So you may be familiar with like your adductors or your quadriceps or your hamstrings. So we have these groups of muscles that work together to do a job, and that maximizes their efficiency, considering a lot of them are third-class levers, which are able to do things fast, but maybe not as strong as they would if they were arranged in a different way, right? So we use certain terms to describe how muscles interact with each other. So the first is called an agonist. An agonist is more commonly referred to as a prime mover, and that's the terminology that I'll use for the most part. But an agonist is going to be the muscle that's primarily responsible for doing that movement. So maybe you'll have a prime mover for wrist flexion, or you'll have a prime mover for thigh adduction, because that is the main muscle who is coordinating or providing the most movement for that particular action. And if we have an agonist, so if we have a prime mover, you're always going to have an antagonist. So much like in a novel, you have your hero and you have your antagonist. So you have their foil. And an antagonist is going to antagonize the agonist or the prime mover. In other words, it's going to do typically the opposite action. So for example, you have a muscle that is the prime mover for thigh extension. If it is the prime mover for thigh extension, it will also be an antagonist to thigh flexion. Because again, muscles can only pull, they can't push. So if I can do one action, so if I can flex, and I'm prime mover for that, I can't, or I would resist extension, because that's the opposite type of movement, right? You also have two other terms. We won't really talk too much about fixators. Fixators are basically muscles that kind of like stabilize, and that's usually the terminology we'll use, but we don't usually notate them especially. But we also have synergist, and synergist just means like an assistant. So it may not be the primary muscle that does that movement, but it helps out, all right? It's part of that group, maybe not in name, but in action it is. So for our part, we'll primarily focus on prime movers and synergists, and then we'll mention when something is an antagonist. And so there is your breakdown of each of those four terms. Note that these are not necessarily things you have to memorize, but it's always helpful to know who provides the main action or the prime moving for a particular action within a muscle's job. Okay. Like I mentioned before, muscles that are working in opposition, typically, but not always, they tend to be on opposite sides. So for example, all right, I have my bicep brachii located here on the anterior portion of my humerus or my brachial region. Bicep brachii is one of three main muscles that is involved in flexion of the forearm or at the elbow. On the posterior side, so underneath, if you will, or on the back side of my brachium is my tricep brachii. My tricep brachii is the prime mover for arm extension or for forearm extension at the elbow. So you have these two muscles located on opposite sides of the same joint, the elbow, and they are going to perform antagonistic functions. So while the bicep brachii may be a synergist for forearm flexion, it's an antagonist for extension, and vice versa for the tricep. And you can see here pictured in your slides, you'll be able to take a look. There's your example of the bicep with flexion extension. You also have examples that include ab and adduction, so various muscles of the legs especially, and also in our rotator cuffs, our shoulders, where you have muscles that are involved in abduction or adduction. And then you also have medial and lateral rotators. So we'll see as we make our way through the muscles that there are certain muscles that are involved in medial rotation and certain in lateral. And that is something you want to pay attention to, which type of rotation. And again, you have all of these body parts, so it's usually really helpful to do a lot of the actions when you are studying, because it helps literally with muscle memory for this anatomy. All right, heading into the last part of our overview here is that we have to name a lot of muscles. So you've got roughly around 700 skeletal muscles. I promise you're not learning those. You're going to learn a fraction of the amount of muscles, not even what we normally do. And there are numerous ways in which we have named them. And here are just a few of the characteristics we use to name things. So one of the ways is by looking at the region of the body. So where is it? So I mentioned bicep brachii. I don't just call it my bicep because we have another bicep in our body. So it's the bicep brachii, meaning it's the bicep in my brachial region, in my arm. You have a muscle there, it's shown there, the temporalis. All right, we know our temporal bone or a temporal lobe of our brain is here. You have a very large fan-shaped muscle that sits on either side of your head. We also name muscles based on their position, their directions, or their fascicle arrangements. So again, those orbicularis muscles around our mouth and around our eye are named based on the circular nature of their fascicle arrangements. Structural characteristics. So there may be things about the particular muscles that are helpful in naming them. They make them unique. Maybe how the fibers are aligned, or other aspects, which we'll look at in a minute. Or action. All right, we often name things based on what it does. So we have lots of flexors and extensors and adductors in our body because it tells us what they do. Right. So here's just a few examples of some of those naming characteristics. So one of those things is based on how many origins a muscle has. So we have biceps, triceps, and quadriceps. That tells us how many heads or how many parts that muscle is broken up into and where it attaches at its origin. So just as a heads up, we have a variety of ways in which we can name muscles, and we will talk about all of those as we encounter individual muscle groups. Lastly here, we will talk about these muscles in 6 groups. You have a muscles list. You want to reference that as kind of your go-to list to keep track. We have axial muscles located, axial skeletal muscles that are located on that axial skeleton. So head, neck, pectoral girdle, and our vertebral column. And then we have appendicular muscles. So we will have muscles that are going to be attaching to our appendages, so our arms and our legs. And we will be covering a good chunk of each of those.